Stephen King, literary genius. When considering the merit of a true American literary author, Stephen King does not automatically come to mind. Stephen King published his first novel, Carrie, in 1977. He is credited also for writing over 45 novels, as well as several short fiction and nonfiction writings. Other noted writings include The Shining, Misery, and The Green Mile. Perhaps you've seen The Green Mile on the big screen. Stephen King has also written under the pen name of Richard Bachman. In this book, Thinner, Richard Bachman is the author, who is actually Stephen King. He even goes so far as to publish a picture that of course is not Stephen King. King has been a novelist and screenwriter over 30 years, and is perhaps best known for his horror novels. However, horror novels and authors of this genre generally are not accepted as true literary geniuses and are not placed among the literary greats such as Faulkner or Dickens. So then, how does Stephen King fit the mold of literary genius? While it is relatively simple for critics to point out what is not good literature, it's rather difficult for them to point out what makes good literature that stands the test of time. This speech will discuss some of the arguments against and assertions for the recognition of Stephen King as a master literary genius, and answer the question of whether or not his writings should reside with the literary greats. Critics have dubbed King a prolific and immensely popular writer of horror fiction, blending elements of the traditional Gothic tale with those of the modern psychological thriller, detective, and science fiction genres to create a compelling tale of the macabre. It is important to note here just what is considered literary genius. According to an article found on popmatters.com, a critic states that the definition of literature is a writing that is technically imaginative and creative, and that consists of an analysis or experience and a synthesis of feelings into a unity. If the writing can produce an emotional state, or clearly is aesthetic or cognitive in experience, then the writing is considered valuable literature. King refers to his own efforts as the Big Mac and fries of fiction, and downplays them for their, quote, dispensable and empty calorie count. Additionally, the website known as Gale Group contains a literary criticism regarding Stephen King that states his fiction features colloquial language, clinical attention to physical detail and emotional states, realistic settings, and an emphasis on contemporary problems. His exploration of such social issues as marital infidelity and peer group acceptance lend credibility to the supernatural elements of his fiction. However, other critics dismiss King's writing as works of literary value, asserting it lacks literary merit because of its commercial popularity. He has often been dubbed a formula writer and one who relies on coincidental plots and sketchy characterizations. According to Wikipedia.com, the first novel King wrote was Carrie, which we've seen before. It's the story of a young girl with psychic powers who feels like an outsider in her high school. She suffers teasing and humiliation by her high school mates until she loses control, gaining revenge against her tormentors. That ultimately results in disaster. Interestingly, the novel was actually discarded out of King's frustration, only to be rescued from the trash can by his wife Tabitha. It's interesting to note in this book that in his beginning thank you, he states, "This is for Tabby, who got me into it and then bailed me out of it." Of course, alluding to the trash can. Later, he received the prestigious acclaim of international bestseller for this book. The novel was translated into a big screen in the late 70s. One critic here states on the GaleNet website that upon viewing this movie, he states, "I believe that the image of actress Spacek as Carrie, standing on the stage at her prom with pig's blood running down her face, is one of the more indelible icons from the long line of horror flicks that have come down over the years." Since the publication and subsequent screen adaptation of Carrie, public awareness of the author and his works has reached an all-time high. Another of Carrie's more impressive writings is that of Misery. Written in 1987, the story begins as Paul Sheldon, also a writer, regains consciousness to learn that he is the victim of a car wreck and that he has been rescued and subsequently imprisoned by Annie Wilkes, a middle-aged, deranged ex-nurse and Sheldon's biggest fan. He suffers miserably at the hands of this woman until he finally kills her and escapes, only to find that his suffering at the hands of his biggest fan actually turned out to be the fueling factor for his main character's best-selling novel ever. Critics of Misery remark that Misery is charged throughout the novel with sexual symbolism and is nothing more than a battle of the sexes. The literary criticism of Natalie Schroeder in Gale Group states that Misery is a psychological thriller, a frightening tale of the reality of everyday life, of repressed fears, of pain, frustration, loneliness, insecurity, insanity, dependence, and disintegration. And although there are no explicit sexual scenes in the novel, Misery exploits Freudian metaphorical representations of sexuality. She goes on to say that Misery depicts an ultra-violent sexual battle that ends in a stalemate. Another noted critic of Misery states that Misery is symbolic of the concept of masochism from a psychoanalytic perspective. It seems King's own personal masochistic addictions were realized through his works. Kesey notes, in Misery, Paul suffers a car accident from which he is rescued by the false nurse Annie, who pierces him with needles and cuts off his foot. As once before, when he wrote himself out of his masochistic addictions, King likens his own near-fatal car accident to that of Paul and works out his fears and doubts through the writings of Misery. Thus, King identifies through his own personal misery with his own characters. According to USA Today, King was also honored to receive the 2003 Medal for Distinguished Contribution to American Letters from the National Book Foundation. Although he has fielded much criticism for this award, King brushes it off, stating that one man's opinion does not necessarily speak for every man's opinion. Wikipedia.com gives King the distinction as the best-selling novelist in the world and the most financially successful horror writer in the world. He is also dubbed as an American horror icon of the highest order. When asked why he writes, King responds, "The answer to that is fairly simple. There is one thing that I do, and that is write. I was made to write stories, and I love to write stories. That's why I do it. I really can't imagine doing anything else, and I can't imagine not doing what I do." In conclusion, although some critics of King's work would not agree, supporters of King's work allege that his literature endures unquestionably, and that he resides in the annals of literary masters comparable to Poe in his handling of word and thought in horror writing. He has written books that surely stand the test of time and translate across the years with the likenesses of the well-remembered and respected literary geniuses of all time.